Good afternoon, and we're back now talking about how we can scale EV charging infrastructure. In the IEA's net zero emissions pathway, 60% of all new car sales will be electric by 2030. This was just 9% in 2021, which was already a tripling of EV stock compared to 2018. The question is, can the charging infrastructure follow suit? The 2014 Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive recommended that EU member states reach 10 electric light-duty vehicles per public charger by 2020. In 2021, the EU's average EV to charger ratio was 14. The proposed new EU legislation, the Alternative Fueling Infrastructure Regulation, or AFIR, would mandate 1 kilowatt of publicly available charger per battery electric vehicle, which we were just above last year. The numbers vary across countries, with Norway and the Netherlands generally having a pretty good ratio, while Germany falls behind with 25 charge points per EV, and Poland falling behind in capacity with 2.5 kilowatts of charging per EV. So let's talk about how this will develop in the future and how we can ensure that we have enough chargers to encourage the increase in e-mobility that we need. To discuss this, we have Roland van der Put, who has worked as an auditor and ICT manager before making the jump to fast charging in 2014. He is now head of charging technology at Fastned, where he's responsible for providing guidance on technical topics and standardization processes, ensuring that Fastned is able to use the latest technologies with regards to charging, local renewable energy generation and energy integration, and optimizing the existing infrastructure. Fastned is building a European network of fast charging stations for EVs, currently with over 210 stations operational in 6 countries. Thank you so much for joining us, Roland.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Good afternoon. Glad you can be here. We also have Gert-Jan Geerinckx, who has experience in the areas of market development, business growth, digital and operations transformation. He is currently head of Europe Power Business Development at NIO, which involves developing the footprint of NIO power and energy businesses across Europe, including the revolutionary combination of battery as a service and EV battery swap, high power and energy related user services, including power as a service, and more. NIO aims to lead the way to a smart autonomous future. Gert-Jan, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And we have Tanya Sinclair, who has experience in public affairs management, partnerships, government relations, and consulting, to name a few. She's worked in policy at ChargePoint for over 4 years and is now Senior Director of Policy in Europe. ChargePoint provides comprehensive charging solutions for businesses, fleets, and drivers. They have delivered 98 million chargers since 2007. Now, someone plugs into a ChargePoint every second. Tanya, great that you can be here.
Great to be here, thank you.
And finally, we have Vincent Schachter, who has gathered over 12 years of experience in e-mobility and new energy services from Total Energies, Wattsnets, eMotorworks, and Enel X. He was most recently head of global energy services at Enel X, a subsidiary in startup mode that focuses on kickstarting sales of charging stations, software, and charging services. Vincent, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you all, and great that we can all be in the room together to discuss a pretty important topic. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, Roland, the EU Commission and said that it wants 10 CPs for every EV. Is this a good or achievable target, or should we measure success by some other measure?
Well, the number of charge points, of course, is important, especially for ad hoc charging or destination charging. But also fast chargers can contribute a lot to bringing capacity online for all those EVs that still have to come on the market. So we are advocating that this metric is expressed in kilowatts per EV, so that both fast chargers and destination chargers help in bringing the right capacity for all the EVs on the market. If we just focus on destination charging, so AC charging, then you're limited to 11 kilowatts. Then, of course, it's easier to achieve a certain number of charge points per electric vehicle. But a single fast charger can serve dozens, if not hundreds of cars a day. And that greatly helps bringing that capacity for those EVs as well. So we advocate kilowatts per electric vehicle on the market.
Yeah.
But of course, there should be a healthy balance between fast charging and destination charging. I think that's critical as well to note.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk more about that later. Tanya, what is holding us back from implementing more chargers? And what sort of incentives do we need or funding changes to make EVs and EV charging the most attractive option for both consumers and businesses?
Well, I think I want to start, instead of talking about what's holding us back, about, what the opportunity is ahead. And it's really important that we think about the iterative growth of the charging market relative to the size of the car market. For businesses like all of us here today, it's not sustainable for us to look at targets for number of cars to chargers, get them all in the ground, and then just wait for those cars to materialize. So this is something that we look at in the charging industry. And, we really also welcome the work that government is doing in really close consultation with the industry to come up with a way of managing the growth of this industry in a way that is going to support the car market to full electrification. So you mentioned the AFIR regulation in Europe at the moment. And, the point that Roland mentioned is something that not just Fastned are calling for in terms of power related targets, but actually the whole industry is calling for in our organization, trade association, Charge Up Europe. And what's really important about that is that that is being a target that's being considered from the industry to the government. So, when we talk about what's needed, it's about this continual close consultation between industry and government to get the right outcome for the whole market.
Thanks. And when we talk in terms of installing chargers, Gert-Jan, obviously we have a lot of challenges with supply chains and physical installation of the chargers. How can we overcome those to make sure that we get enough EV chargers on our roads?
I think this is the crux of many things, right? When you look at the beautiful background that Roland has on him, it took quite a while to get everything up and running, right? This is one of the premium sites in Hilden. I was there last. We built up actually one of our battery swap stations there. And what you see is that we're all struggling with getting the basics in place, getting transformers, getting grid connections. Those things very often take very, very long time when you're talking high power. So I think there's a place for government and energy companies to look into solving those things. But at the same time, you need the guys with the cargo pants that do the real work, the guys with the screwdrivers and everything that put these things in place. And you've got many companies now facing supply chain issues, but just facing we have stock, we can't install the things. And I think the industry itself and the players itself should probably look closer to working together rather than competing with each other. And you see a very beautiful example at what Hilden looks like, where Tesla and Fastned are working, where we are also there. So I think that's a beautiful example of collaborations already coming together. But I think at this point, the EV market is still small enough that you don't have to compete, but the cake's big enough for everyone. And if everyone gets that, the installation companies get that, and we know where we're going, then I think that could be the right direction.
Roland, do you want to add anything about that, of the kind of difficulties that you've experienced of installing things and the importance of collaboration?
Yeah, the economies of scale help. So if you build a bigger station like here in Hilden, you can do everything at scale, with help in reducing the number of parts that you need, but especially also in manpower, because you only need to build a roof once, for instance, or instead of installing 2 chargers, we install 4 or 8 or 20. So that all contributes to efficiencies. Usually there is some kind of limitation, either the grid is limited or the supply chain is limited or the number of people that can actually do the work are limited. So usually one of the 3 is the bottleneck for speeding things up. So we sort out one element and then another one kicks in, a person gets sick or there's a hiccup in the supply chain, and that might cause a delay. So we also try to streamline all the construction activities that we do. So at Fastned, we're getting quite good in planning well in advance and then streamlining the construction because then we limit the number of people that are needed in that process as well. But yeah, we see the struggle everywhere. Also, governments can do a lot because especially around permits, they hold us back, and not only us, but also the grid companies. So the whole process of getting the right permits in place before you can put the first shovel in the ground, that's really critical, and it's also critical for the grid because the grid companies need a lot of permits before they can upgrade the grid, and obviously that's important for charging infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Roland. And obviously, a big part of that is aligning all of the different interests of the different players involved in setting up a charging station. And obviously, doing destination charging at the shops, at gyms, at different things like that. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of parties. Vincent, how can we overcome some of those challenges to align all of those interests?
Well, as you said, there are many challenges, and the key to solving them is to align. So I would start by the most obvious, which is we need a good customer experience for the driver. But in the case of destination charging, well, you have the destination business owner, and that business owner needs to also be able to get something out of it. And so that there are many ways to try and do this, but there needs to be enough value for whoever is operating the network and the business owner to share. That's starting with obvious things. Then, if I were to list the challenges beyond smooth customer experience and business models, I would say installation and operations and maintenance is still a challenge. That's not limited to destination charging, but it's also the case there. And I think my colleagues made a pretty good point of this. It is a challenge. The general public is very much aware of it. And until it gets solved more generally by all players in the value chain, there will be a part of the general public who will think, well, EV charging just doesn't work, right? So that I would say is a big one. Backend software is a very important enabler. It needs to work, it needs to be simple and efficient, and it needs to be interoperable. Now, interoperability has made a lot of progress, so let's follow Tanya's lead and be positive first. Since this game started years ago, huge progress on CCS 15118 on the one hand, OCPP, all of that, good. On the other hand, they're still far from being universally operational and working well. If I take the experience of just authentifying yourself on a public or semi-public or semi-private charging station, well, good luck. This idea that plug and charge should work, you just plug in and magically you're authenticated and the billing works and all of this. The standards, well, or the proposal for a standard has been out there. Is it really adopted by how many players? I'll let my colleagues comment on that. I think we're very, very far from full interoperability on the simplest things, which is authentication, billing, charging session. And then you have another piece of this, which is the grid. So grid connection takes time, too long, and it's actually worse than this. It's unpredictable. So I don't know, it depends on the country. In France, I can tell you, you can ask for the interconnection to the DSO, and then maybe you'll get an answer eventually, and maybe you'll know if it's going to happen in 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months, right? So that cannot continue for very long because it detracts from predictability for all players. That's just installation. But then, especially now that with what's happening with the price of energy and electricity in this case, being able to use charging stations coupled with EV batteries as grid assets is becoming important. It used to be a vision thing. It used to be a nice cherry on the pie, smart charging and V2G. But now, again, because of these unfortunate circumstances, it's becoming frontline again. And I cannot predict how much revenue share this will create in the entire industry, but I can tell you that unless these assets can be managed as energy resources fast, it's going to block adoption because energy management here is of significant economic value. So interoperability again, but on a much broader scope.
Thanks, Vincent. I think a lot that we can kind of dig deeper into. First, I want to talk about software. Roland, what is the role of software in enabling us to scale EV charging more quickly?
Yeah, we've already discussed about the supply chain issues that everyone is seeing, and also the manpower that is lacking in general. A lot of focus is currently on getting more chargers in the ground, getting more capacity. But we can also make steps by using that capacity more efficiently. And with that, I mean both the chargers and the grid. But if I zoom in on the grid first, currently a lot of grid operators, they will allocate a certain amount of capacity for charging 24/7. So there's little to no flexibility on the DSO side by allocating grid capacity for charging infrastructure. Well, on a site like Hilden, for instance, it is owned by a bakery. Now you can imagine that if the site is busy during the day, then it consumes a lot from the grid next to the solar panels it has. But during the night, those locations tend to be much more quieter. So then there's a lot of spare capacity on the grid. Now, if the bakery would start its production during the evening and during the night and early morning hours, we can basically share the same capacity that we require on the grid. But currently, there are a lot of restrictions in terms of regulations and also in terms of what DSO can deal with. So they don't offer us this flexibility. So that means that the grid operator allocates capacity to the bakery and to the charging station. So both of us claim capacity on the grid, while technically it's not needed, and we could do this in a much more dynamic way. So there are many opportunities on the grid side to implement flexibility, and by using software and more flexible regulations, we can take better use of all the hardware that is already in the ground, and that is perfectly capable of supporting more businesses like fast charging or charging in general. Now, on the charging infrastructure side, there are also opportunities, because right now a lot of cars have onboard navigation systems that plan a trip which is optimal for the user. But typically, these trip planners don't take into account how busy the location is before actually including it in the trip planner. Now, in a perfect world, we as operators know exactly which chargers will be busy in the next 30, 60, 90 minutes from now, and which cars are coming to us. So in that way, we can steer traffic basically to locations which are not so busy, or to hours where it's not so busy. And that means instead of a utilization of maybe 30% that we might see today, we could increase to 40, 50, or maybe even higher percentages, so that we can serve more customers and for us sell more kilowatt hours without having to install more chargers on that same spot. So by using software and improving trip planning for vehicles, we can make better use of the infrastructure that is already out there. And that is not even started yet, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there to facilitate the adoption of EVs.
Gert-Jan, did you want to add something to that point?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to look at the reference, and of course the role of software is really, really critical, but you can do a few things much more pragmatical and different by just adding different alternatives, right? And you know that NIO does battery swapping. When you talk about that fixed grid capacity, just imagine running a fuel station, and the moment that a car comes, you need the fuel to be pumped up from whatever gas field it comes from. That doesn't really sound sustainable. You know, when you look at a fuel station, there's a big container that has all the fuel and it's regularly filled up. When you go to a high power charger, and you see in this one in Hilden, there's already 4 cars charging. So you need about 4 times 320 kilowatts to get maximum power. That's 1.2 megawatts. That's a lot of power you need right now to be filled to the cars. Good solution, it works because the grid works that way. But of course, it has limitations. You cannot continue to add cars to this garage, to this charger, and get the same power output. That's one. And secondly, eventually you're just run out of power that is available right now. There's only that many windmills and only that many coal mines that can fuel up and give you power right now. And I think that's where NIO comes in with quite of a simplistic but innovative solution, where we say, look, with battery swapping, we offer to charge the batteries at off-peak times, at times when there's no 10 cars charging, at times when the bakery is not, he's not woken up yet at 4 o'clock to start baking his pastries. So we can do that smart charging without any intelligent software that predicts all of that. So I think in that way, you can be much more pragmatical and simplistic by using all the capacity there and giving that to users or customers that need that electricity to continue their trip.
Yeah, thanks. We've actually had an question from the audience related to battery swapping. Hardy wants to know, before swapping the battery, would the battery's health be tested? If not, how can you assure providing the next customer with a good battery and ensure that they reach their final destination? And what happens at the end of the life? Yeah.
So there's a few things to unfold here, right? But so first of all, the battery swapping is something that NIO does proprietary. So we know all the vehicles, where they are, when they're coming. So we can already dynamically predict what battery we need to charge so that a user gets a fully charged battery. And of course, we can track everything to cell level. So as vehicles come in, we know what their state of charge is, how much capacity we need to give them, and what battery they want. They effectively reserve in our system by just putting their navigation on. So we know what happens with the batteries. From the moment the battery enters the swapping station, it is fully scanned. And because obviously we develop the battery cells, packages, and packs ourselves, we can read everything out to not yet chemistry level, but to cell level. So we know the temperature, we know the health condition and everything. So that allows us to manage those batteries. When you come to end of life, we have a responsibility towards ourselves, but also the community, to make sure that our batteries have the longest possible life. At the end of the day, it's a battery as a service. So the user doesn't own the battery, they pay a monthly fee. So it's in our interest to keep these batteries at best health. If you keep a battery in a battery hotel, it's constantly at ideal temperature, it's constantly monitored. That's much better than keeping a car in the freezing cold, which generally is not good for batteries, or not in the heat, which also generally isn't good for batteries. So having them in a battery hotel allows us to preserve that lifespan already longer. And at the end of the time, and at the end of the lifetime, the battery is still something you can specifically use. You can use different use cases. And because we've set up our business in that way, that we have an asset company that owns all the batteries, we can actually do larger economies of scale building that out. Imagine if you have 1 and 2 cars, you need to take 1 and 2 batteries, you need to collect that to a battery, someone needs to buy it. That's all very, very complex in terms of business supply chain. We own those batteries, so we can immediately change into an innovation or bring something else.
Mm-hmm. And Roland, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I think Vincent already mentioned interoperability as well, and as Gert-Jan indicated, the battery swapping of NIO is proprietary to NIO vehicles or to particular types of vehicles. And for fast charging, it doesn't mean that all chargers take full power from the grid. So we use solutions as load balancing, yep. So that we can dynamically allocate the available power to the vehicle's charging. So depending on what capacity there is available on the grid, and that could vary during the day, we can either increase or decrease the charge speed of the vehicle's charging at that moment to make sure that everything stays within the boundaries set by the DSO or by the site operator. So there's a lot we can do already today to mitigate the impact of charging infrastructure on the grid. And specifically at Hilden, that's interesting because there's also battery storage involved and solar power. So that combination of solar power and fast charging is perfect as well, because generally most fast charging is done during the day, and that's also when the sun tends to shine, and particularly during summer. So that's a great combination of having solar and fast charging. And the beauty of charging in general, but fast charging in particular as well, is that the standards are interoperable. So the NIO vehicles can charge, but also Tesla's, BMW, and you name it. So that works for all vehicles. So I'm also a bit wondering how you would scale up battery swapping with multiple brands. Because I think this is where things get complicated, also in terms of space usage.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I see that Vincent has his hand raised, so I don't want to interrupt him.
No, go ahead, respond, and I'll comment afterwards, please.
No, I mean, Roland, you're absolutely right. I mean, dynamic load balancing is something that that's really important for the grid. I would take the stance of a user and say, look, I want the 320 when I come in, but you know, that's kind of the balance that you're always fighting for. With battery swapping, you get a full battery always, so you maybe have a 5-minute wait if someone's in the swap station already, but of course, you know, it has trade-offs and balances. I think when it comes to the openness of our standards, what you see in China is that a lot has happened there already. Originally, NIO comes from China, so we have experimented and we've learned there a lot. And what you see is that there's many operators of battery swapping. You have Cattle, you have Geely, all of them are coming with battery swap solutions. And what you're now seeing is that the Chinese government and the Chinese regulators are really starting to look to do exactly this. How do we make this smarter? How do we make this more interoperable in a way? And NIO's always had the stance, dual stance. We develop it for our vehicles, so it's the best possible and the fastest solution, so that we have a competitive advantage over any other EV out there. Charges in, you know, full battery in 5 minutes. No one else does that at this moment. You'd have to do a tenfold of 320 kilowatt charging, and compare that to it being open standard, so we're open to anyone. So any vehicle manufacturer is open to have those conversations with us on the platform. But I think, you know, we all know that these are difficult things to have car giants to cooperate. But we'll see what happens. I think once the market gets traction on this, once people start to see that battery swapping is something that they enjoy and that actually adds significant value, then others will have to follow. And it's easy to then look left and right and see who really has some technology there. And we're more than happy to support car makers at that moment.
Vincent, what was your view on this?
Well, so on battery swapping, to be honest, my comment was more on what you can do with charging stations and cars without battery swapping. Yep. So I agree with Roland that there are many things that you can do on balance on energy services in general, local optimization. So balancing the load on the one hand, integrating with the grid on the other hand. Lots of progress there, not mature. The most important piece is that the need is adequately perceived, which it is now. And again, it's the business model at the end of the day. The interoperability follows usually, right? And it's on the way. So we'll talk probably about VTP. Now on battery swapping, look, it's a great idea. And it's an economics play, right? Whereas it makes sense from the business model perspective with the cost of logistics, or not, I don't know. When Better Places came up with that idea 15 years ago as the grandfather of part of this industry, it didn't make sense, the economics. It is very possible that now it might. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I think in the case of Hilden, in the background of my picture, you see a nice cafeteria with great bakery products. So if you have only 5 minutes there and you have to remain in the vehicle while performing the battery swap, there's not really an opportunity to enjoy the bakery products and the coffee they have. So in that case, I would still opt for maybe 15, 20 minutes break outside of my car and get a good cup of coffee and some nice pastries.
Yeah.
You can still Roland bakery, so don't worry about it. You can still get out of the car after you've done the swap.
May I make just a quick comment on load balancing and energy services and all of this? Public charging is a very different context from private charging, right? Yeah. So public charging, well, do you really want to wait 10 more minutes and have a second cup of coffee because the software decides that it needs to balance your load with that of the other part who are waiting in line, and therefore you have to wait more? Whereas if you're in a private setting, these choices can be made and arbitraged on also because you have more predictability. If you're in a public charging setting, I'm scratching my head on how you do this. And I imagine that you would need to actually manage your energy locally and probably store it or produce it locally. You mentioned solar, but I just want to emphasize that smart charging in a public charging setup is a very different game.
Yeah, I
Roland?
think you raise a very valid point there, Vincent, because it all hinges on how aggressive you want to do the load balancing. And we've seen cases in the past where the load balancing was very aggressive. If 2 or 4 vehicles came to a location, that immediately there was a big drop in power that the car would get. But it doesn't have to be the case with today's technologies. So in the case of Hilden, for instance, and some of the other sites we have, customers will not notice that we have some load balancing mechanisms going on the background, because these mechanisms are only in place for the odd situation whereby multiple cars arrive at the same moment with empty batteries and they all want to charge at high power, because we cannot afford to reserve 10 times 300 kilowatts for all those cars, which maybe happen just once every year or so. So that's why we get less capacity on the grid in these cases, and we have the load balancing mechanisms making sure that we don't trip the fuse of the trafo and the grid connection. So in 99% of the cases, customers don't notice it, and in the other 1% of the cases, it's going to be really busy, and yes, then customers may have to charge a few more minutes. Now, the other case where it may actually impact customers is where there's a grid limitation. So in the case of delays in expanding the grid connections, you still want to offer customers the opportunity to charge. And then you can either decide to just install 2 chargers offering 300 kilowatts, or you can do 4 or 6, but then they will have to share. And then everyone, yes, they will have to wait a little bit longer, but the grid is simply limited. So I think all the operators are facing that. I'm sure ChargePoint is facing that as well at certain occasions. That's the way to make better use of the available capacity. So sometimes out of necessity and sometimes out of not straining the grid too much.
Thanks, Roland. And Tanya, we've been talking a lot about interoperability. Can you tell us about the role of peer-to-peer roaming agreements and kind of opening up charging networks?
Yeah, well, it's a really good place to follow on from the importance of software, because that is a fully software-enabled feature that, thinking back to 2014 and the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive that you mentioned, that just really didn't exist then. The European charging market is, has hardware at its origins, and we're now transitioning all of us into software-led businesses. And one of the opportunities that offers is the ability to roam between networks. So that means that I, as a ChargePoint driver, app or card holder, can then open up ideally any network of my choosing. And it's super important, not just for me and my preference as a private driver, but when we think about the different use cases of EV driver that have yet to transition. So we're thinking about fleet operators, commercial vehicle drivers, taxi drivers, maybe those kinds of people. And they really need to have not just the ability to access charging, but access all of the information about their charging events wherever they go, in one place. And if you multiply that by 1,000 or 5,000, if you're a major fleet operator, that information needs to be in a reliable, consistent format for you to be able to plan your business of running electric vehicle fleets. So roaming is critical. How you do it is software-led. And like you say, peer-to-peer roaming is really the means of achieving this in a way that the market can have the security and the confidence to be able to have a fully interoperable driver experience. That it's not the only way, but ChargePoint certainly has pioneered this means of being able to broker individual roaming agreements between charging networks and develop the full interoperability that way. Now, seeing as we talked about challenges up front, let's be honest, we're not there yet in all markets. So, where I'm sitting right now in the UK, we have a way to go. There's other countries in Europe, Sweden comes to mind, where there's a way to go on roaming. But this is where we look to governments and, at European or national level to not so much impose laws, but really tell the market that that is what their expectation is. And when we see that happen, we see governments say, we would like you all, the market, to become interoperable. Suddenly we start to see the participants in that market moving in that direction a little more quickly, which is what we all want to see as EV drivers.
And on that note, the Netherlands has always done quite well in terms of the number of EV chargers available. Roland or Gert-Jan, can you provide some insight onto what maybe the government in the Netherlands has done correctly to enable that, or are there other factors involved?
Shall I start, Gert-Jan? Yeah, I think in the Netherlands, we've been pretty pragmatic. So instead of seeing it as a way to compete, we first think about increasing the cake. So rather than fighting for the cake, we increase the size of the cake. And that's particularly important in a new market as EV charging has been, or maybe still is, in Europe. So we've also been at the foundation of protocols such as OSPP and OCPI in the Netherlands, and we've been actively advocating the adoption of that worldwide. So we've done that as well. So we are a big fan of peer-to-peer roaming connections, and we have around 50 of them at the moment, and that number is increasing steadily. And that allows us to grant access to our network by MSPs and by fleet owners, so that they have all the information in one place, as Tanya already mentioned. So yes, the Netherlands is ahead, and markets as Belgium and Germany are doing well as also, but particularly the Nordics and the UK, they are lagging behind. So in the UK, we're seeing some traction now, because some of the mainland players are also offering roaming on several networks in the UK, but that market is still very, very much scattered. So as a backup solution, we will also offer payment terminals. So we already have payment terminals in place in an increasing number of locations, a couple of dozen locations at the moment, with the ambition to have them installed in all of our locations in all the 6 countries where we are operating in the coming months. And then we'll see, because then drivers have the option of either using their phone or credit card or bank card to pay, or the RFID tag of maybe a fleet operator that they cooperate with. So that gives consumers more choice. But the underlying technology of roaming is absolutely critical in facilitating all of that.
Gert-Jan, would you add anything to that?
No, I would agree. I think just like Norway, what you've seen in the Netherlands is extreme, pragmatism and incentives in the beginning. The Norwegians had the car tax revoked from electric cars. The Dutch had a lot of corporate incentives. So that brought a lot of EVs on the market, especially 2011, 12, and 13. You saw a lot of Mitsubishi Outlanders and Tesla Model S on the road, which obviously, when you look at the density of the country, works well in one way. Distances are short. You can get through the country in 2 hours. If you live in Norway, you go from one city, you kind of generally stay in those areas. So it's geographically optimal. You don't have that in Germany. You don't have that in France, where distances are 200-300 kilometers is what you do in a day for the commute. And secondly, I think also the level of willingness from cities. When you look at Amsterdam, when you look at Rotterdam, I think jointly they have over 5,000 charging stations, public charging stations, which allow people who don't live in the city, live in metro areas, to use that electric car. And I think those two things have gone hand in hand to support EV drivers in adopting electric mobility. Will that change? Will you see that more in Germany? I think it depends on how can we cater to the use case of the users. Will we change that quickly in France and the UK? It'll probably take a little bit more time. You need more vehicles on the road. You need more understanding of how that EV charging market works. You need more players like Fastned. You need more players like NIO that bring the alternatives to show that driving an EV is a real solution. Because let's not forget, even though Model Y is a top-selling car, there's still more gas cars on the road than there are electric cars. And we need to really fight the gas car from getting more on the road. Now that's happening by 2035. We're saying that we don't want any gas cars on the road anymore, but it really needs to start happening, and that infrastructure needs to move as well. And all those solutions that make it a worry-free solution for someone to get an electric car really need to come out. And I think this group here can solve part of that, but it's mostly the car makers and all the pragmatic things on the bottom that we touched on shortly.
And Vincent, can you offer any insight into the strengths or weaknesses of French legislation in encouraging interoperability, greater adoption of EVs and charging infrastructure?
I think French legislation is not unique in that respect. There is just a little bit of injected French Cartesianism and more regulation than average. That's it. But maybe what I can share is the sentiment that you see from the general public. I would say the country, what I see, and again, this is anecdotal, this is not solid statistics, but so there is a growing fraction of drivers or potential drivers that are interested by electric because they think it's the right thing to do, because saving the planet is the most important topic on the table now, and because they live in big cities, and because it's not such a hassle for them. Out of those, there is a category of people who say, no, let's be serious here. Electric is not a solution, because I went again in August or July with my whole family down to the Riviera or to Brittany, and seriously look at the traffic jams and look at the lines. What if I had had an electric car that day? It's clearly impossible. So you see, people are reasoning on peak capacity. They're always, I mean, the number of times that I hear about that, those 1 or 2 times a year where they need to do 1,000 kilometers, it's completely disproportionate. Then I hear something else, which is much more worrisome, because this one, I think actually people in this room may have the tools to solve it. It's a matter of very fast charging on specific corridors with enough capacity, and whether it makes sense to invest for that peak capacity is a different question, and it may be subsidized. But now what you have also is a part of the population that doesn't live in big cities, that needs to take their cars every day to commute, mid-length commutes, and they're not really worried about the charging. They will put this forward as a reason why EV charging doesn't work well. You very well know it doesn't work, right? That kind of speech. But the truth is they think it's expensive, it's an urban bobo dream, and it is not something serious for real people who need to watch every cent and every penny when they move around with their diesel car. And this I hear a lot, and I can't put numbers or percentages on the population on this. But I think, but I keep hearing from people, let's be serious, those guys are never gonna buy EVs. Never, of course not, right? So that I think is a more interesting question. And I'd be curious to hear about my my co-panelists, what's happening in the Netherlands or UK, and does that, does that segment of the population, is it so prevalent there?
Tanya, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think across Europe that there is a demographic that says they're never going to buy an electric vehicle, or it's not for them. It doesn't matter what their mileage is, what their use case is. This could be a private driver or a fleet driver. They are insistent it's not for them. And to that, I would say soon they're not going to have a choice, because, whether it's 2030 or 2035, in some countries sooner, these vehicles are going to be phased out. And I think what we need to do in the interim is not force anyone into these vehicles, but prove that there is no aspect of compromise, right? Whether it's perceived or real. Okay, so in the case of a fleet, for example, the sense that the vehicle, maybe the payload isn't right or the range isn't right compared to a diesel. And a lot of what we're talking about here is our responsibility in the charging industry, providing that good and reliable, secure charging experience that can be better than fueling, right? It's not just about making it as good as fueling, about making it better than conventional fueling. But it's also contingent upon the other sectors that we were speaking about earlier, right? The vehicles have really got to, especially in the heavier categories, have got to improve. And they've got to be available, right? The supply of those has got to be better. The energy aspect has got to be, reliable in terms of it being a critical fuel, right? And government as well has its role to play in ensuring that this sector, which has grown up really in the last 10 or 15 years, is regulated and supported in a way that it can be a mass market sector. And with all that, I think, the little by little, that population of people that think this is not for them will get smaller and smaller, and then will disappear.
Yeah, interesting. Roland, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I totally agree that we shouldn't force EVs onto people. And I think it's only fortunate that not everyone wants an EV today, because those EVs are simply not available as well. And also the charging infrastructure is not ready yet. So we need, yes, we do need an uptake of EV adoption. And yes, we will get to the, let's say, the harder segments as well. So we need to do convincing, but also showing that it is perfectly possible to drive to the French Riviera or to the Garda Lake without any problems, and that your family still enjoys the trip. Because the way I have seen it in the past 8 years when driving electric, your mindset changes as well. If you go on a longer trip, you don't want to rush going from A to B. Basically, your trip and your holiday already starts as soon as you leave. Because I like driving an EV. And then if you arrive at the fast charging station, whether it's ours or anyone else's fast charging stations, it's a good opportunity to have a break as well. I've done quite a few road trips in the past where I had range anxiety, but with today's cars that can easily do 300 or 400 kilometers and that can charge in about 20-25 minutes, that no longer exists. So on the longer trips I've taken over the last year, usually I needed a break before the car needed charging. So in those cases, I was looking for a place where can I have something to eat or have a bio break and charge at the same time. And before that, until about 2 years ago, it was the other way around. So then I was looking for where do I need to charge? So what's going to be my next charge stop? And what am I going to do in those 30 or 40 minutes that I need to spend? And as time goes by, we will see vehicles that can charge faster, so that can fill up the battery until 80% in 10-15 minutes, and that have a range of 400-500 kilometers. And that means that the whole range anxiety is simply not there anymore. So then we must focus on affordability, because all those vehicles are still rather expensive if you see what the average person buys in terms of vehicles. A lot of second-hand vehicles are being sold, and those electric vehicles are not yet abundantly available as second-hand vehicles. So it's only good that the front runners buy the electric vehicles now, because in a few years, those will be the second-hand vehicles that will then be handed down to the next target group for EV adoption. Mm-hmm. So we must be patient, but we must push for it as well in a different way. But we shouldn't spend too much time on convincing the hardest part of our audience to drive electric. It will come.
Yeah. And when we talk about range anxiety, Gert-Jan, where does battery swapping fit in? How easy is that for people to drive long distances?
Depends a little bit on the region where you're looking for. And just to answer to the question previously, I'm actually quite happy that the laggards haven't adopted EVs yet, because if all the previous ones would have bought an EV, we'd have a big problem. And I think ultimately we shouldn't be looking at getting more EVs on the road or getting more chargers out, but we're looking at energy transition and sustainability. And so how do you get the cleanest energy in your car? An electric car is a great way to do it. High efficiency, you can create clean energy, but it's about enabling that transition. Secondly, the second point that I see is when you look at the majority, we'll stop selling cars before we hit the majority, because the majority today lives, about 62% of the European population lives in a condominium, doesn't have home charging, doesn't go out to fast charge for 40 minutes, makes it a very difficult use case to sell them an electric car. So I think that's where we need to find solutions first. How do you cater to people that want an electric car, but can't get one because it doesn't fit their lifestyle right now? So then when you go into battery swapping, one of the use cases, when you, for example, look at Shanghai, 26 million people live in Shanghai, which is kind of the size of half of Belgium. If you know how big Belgium is, it's small. So a lot of people. And so you get these high rises where 200-300 people live in an apartment building, and you have 15, maybe 30 of these high rises. That's where NIO brought swapping, because we had to find something for that home charging use case. People would simply not get into an electric car because filling up, you go to a gas station, you pump some gas, you're good. Here, you just can't do that because your battery will just go empty, and then you need to go to a 50 kilowatt charger. That was 4 years ago, and you'd be completely stuck for hours, which is not a solution that you'd want. So I think that's what we've solved in China very well, with over 70 of these stations in the city of Shanghai. So again, half of Belgium, 70 swap stations. We can't really imagine that yet. Trust me, it'll come. But when you look at what we're trying to achieve in Europe is a dual use case, right? So we are in locations like Hilden where people are passing by on the German Autobahn. You can go as fast as you want, at least some areas. And that's where electric vehicles also lack. So we really offer a smackdown to the gas car, and we show that you can go as fast as you want. You can swap a battery in 5 minutes. Of course, you need the density of having enough swap stations around, but that's something that by time will come. You know, we have enough partners, and you know, people are very excited about this. So that's the first use case we're solving very, very well, that highway long distance travel use case, so that when you're going to the French Riviera, I did it last summer. I actually went to Spain. I had eight times that I needed to charge. Yeah, after the fourth one, you're done with it. You know, if you then do swapping 5 minutes and you're on the go, then you find a perfect balance between charging when you're having lunch and swapping when you are just on the go. But I think the second one is becoming more and more important as that EV adoption increases. As people in the cities can't get electric cars, they'll try to find these alternatives. And if NIO can be in that peripheral area where you also find relatively low amount of high power chargers, but where you find your car washes, where you find your supermarkets, in those areas, if we can be there, it's a perfect alternative for people that today can't get into an electric car because of their lifestyle.
And we've also touched on the topic of pricing. It's obviously very important to keep EVs and EV charging affordable, to incentivize both people to adopt EVs, site operators to install more chargers, and everything like that to reduce overall system costs of e-mobility. Vincent, how can we ensure that pricing stays low?
So there are not that many ways, right, to ensure that the prices stays low. Either you reduce your costs, which is what the entire industry has been doing for years and is trying to keep doing it. But there are some hiccups sometimes, right? For example, the cost of electricity now. Or you get protection from someone, or subsidies, which is the same. So, and then obviously to optimize your cost, you can also optimize the flow of money once you have your actual operation costs. And this is the business model that we've talked about. But let's look at the cost. Cost of batteries and vehicles going down steadily, fine. As long as we don't have huge supply chain issues, which might come. Cost of electricity or energy, however, out of control in the last few months. So then what can you do? You can go out to governments and say, please protect us. And they may want to do it or not. If they do it, it's a form of subsidy. It's taking taxpayers' money to protect that particular industry because of its role in the energy transition. And governments have been protecting the final consumer with their household electricity rates. And that's particularly big in France, for example. That's tens and tens of billions in 2022, which has been, on the one hand, protecting taxpayers and voters. On the other hand, it has hidden the price signal, meaning that then there is less incentive for people to change their behavior. So that is an interesting question for all governments: is how much do they want to protect the EV charging piece, public charging, private charging? And this one, I'm curious to see where the needle lands. So that I would see as one interesting challenge for all European governments in the next few months, is to decide what they're going to do in 2023 after the big scare of the winter passes.
And we've only got 1 minute left. So Tanya, just quickly in response to that, where do you think governments are on that needle, and how can we ensure an equitable and widespread rollout of EV charging across the continent?
In a nutshell, as the market grows, people will start to vote with their feet for the reasonably priced charging solutions. But we're at a very strange and unusual time when it comes to, the energy crisis. And I would say, finish with a warning, let's say, to companies that want government to intervene to help them out on the cost of charging. Once you let the government in on the price of your charging, then when, prices are lower, the government's not going to go away. And the government is there intervening and regulating pricing, and it's there to stay. So we have to ask ourselves as an industry a serious question about whether we want to retain those market freedoms even in tough times like we are today. I would say yes, we should.
Thank you, Tanya. Very succinct there. And that unfortunately brings us to the end of the session. Really great discussion, a lot of back and forth between all four of you. So thank you to our esteemed panelists who joined us today. Great discussion and a lot for everyone to think about. We'll be back in 2 minutes talking about how we can reach 100% renewable energy.